In this video, I want to talk about Redux middleware. Now, the purpose of Redux middleware is to intercept an action before it reaches the reducer. So when a user interacts with our application, and let's say they click a button, that's going to trigger the UI to dispatch an action. And that we already understand. However, instead of sending that action directly to the reducer like we normally would, we're going to send it to the middleware. And that's why it's called middleware, right? Because it sits in between the dispatching of the action and the reducer. And so once the middleware gets that action object, it really has the freedom to do anything it wants. So it can perform any extra logic. It can modify the action object itself. So if you wanted to, what we could do is we could actually change the action type. We could change the payload. We can add extra payload. We can remove the payload. Heck, we can even drop the action object so it never makes it to the reducer. So we got a lot of flexibility with what we can do with middleware. The only thing it can't do is change the state itself. And that's obvious because the reducer is ultimately responsible for, managing and changing the state. So the middleware can't do that. But everything else, any other kind of logic you want to perform, the middleware is good to go. And if you're having a hard time trying to visualize where all of these pieces fit together, on the screen, I have a diagram that I've shown you before in our Intro to Redux section. However, there's one minor modification, and I've added the middleware in there. So you can see the middleware right there. It's going to be sitting in between that action object and the reducer. So when the UI dispatches the action, right, it's going to send that action object to the reducer. However, in this case, the middleware is going to catch it, right? And so our code's going to run in the middleware, and it's going to perform whatever actions we want. And then once we're done with that, we can then send it to the reducer, who can then figure out what the new state is. And the great part about middleware is that we don't necessarily just have to have one middleware. We can actually string a bunch of middleware together. So here in this example, I've got 3 different middleware. And the way that it works is that action object is going to get sent to the first middleware. The first middleware is going to perform whatever actions it needs to, or whatever logic. And once it's done, it's going to send it to the second middleware. And once that second middleware is done, it's going to send it to the third middleware. And whoever is the last middleware in the stack, which in this case is the third middleware, he's going to then send it to the reducer. So we have the ability to add a whole bunch of extra functionality by adding in extra middleware into our stack. So we have to discuss what exactly is middleware, because I'm sure you're thinking what is it? Is it a special React or Redux object or anything like that? No. Middleware is really just a function that returns another function. And you'll see how simple it is once we actually get to coding it, which we're actually going to do in a few seconds. So I think that's a good stopping point for now. We'll stop here and we'll get started on building a very simple application that's going to be used to demonstrate how we can use middleware to add extra functionality. Okay, to get started, we're going to create a new app. And I'm just going to call this Redux middleware. All right, so once that's complete, we'll just change into that new directory. And so it's going to be called Redux middleware. And I'm going to open that up in VS Code. Now, unfortunately for us guys, for me to actually demonstrate how Redux middleware works, we need to have a fully functional Redux application. So I'm going to have to build out, a simple Redux application. And we know that even simple Redux applications have a lot of boilerplate. So just bear with me. I'm going to build out a simple counter app that uses Redux. And once we've got that built out and confirmed that it works, we're going to then start implementing some Redux middleware. And so like we normally do, I'm going to delete all of our files. Here we'll define our index.js file, and we're going to import React and import React Router DOM. And we'll also need our app.jsx file. And we'll just create a blank component. And then here we'll just render out our app component. So we'll import it. And we'll let VS Code import that for us. And then finally, we'll do a document.get element by ID and send that to root. Oops. All right, and so we're going to open up our terminal, and there's a few things that we have to install. So the first thing is going to be npm install. We need Redux as well as React-Redux. All right, once that's complete, we'll just start our application just to make sure that everything's working so far. And it looks like we got an error. I'm guessing I just forgot to hit save all. Yep, there we go. And if I go to our console, we should see no errors. Perfect. And so what we want to do in our app component is I'm going to build a simple counter. So we'll just put in an H1 tag. And beneath the H1 tag, we'll need two buttons. And the first one is going to be for increment. So we'll make the first one decrement. And the second one is going to be for increment. And now we need to start wiring up the Redux portion of our application. And so I'm not going to put everything into their separate folders because this is just too small of an application, and I want to make this as quick as possible. So what I'll do is I'll create a new file for reducer .js, and then I'll also make a new one for action.js. And so for our reducer, we want to make sure that we're going to export it. So we'll do export const, and we'll call this counter reducer. Our reducer is going to take in two properties, state as well as our action. And we know that we need to give it a default value. So our state's just going to be a simple number. And so I'm going to start it out as 0. And then we have a switch statement, and we're going to switch on action.type. And for the first case, this is going to be when action.type equals increment. And so here, all we're going to do is just return state plus 1. And then the second case is going to be for decrement. And this is just going to return a state minus 1. And then lastly, we need our default case, which is going to be return state. All right, so our reducer is done. The next thing we need to do is define our actions. So we're going to create a few action creators. We'll do const increment. And this is just going to return a type of increment. And we'll just copy that and do the same thing for decrement. All right, and we want to make sure that we're exporting both of these. And then finally, let's go to our index.js and define our store. So we'll do const store equals, and then we have to import create store from the Redux library. So we'll let VS Code do that for us. And then we'll pass in our reducer. So we have to import that as well. And our reducer was called, I think, counter reducer. Yep, we'll let VS Code import that as well. And let's just do a save all. Actually, let's go ahead and wire up the rest of our application. So we know that, first of all, our state, we need to actually retrieve our state so that we can render it to this H1 tag. And so we need to use the use selector hook. So we'll do const, I'm just going to call this count, and we'll just say equals use selector. So we'll import that from the Redux library. And we'll say take in the state, and we want to return all of the state because the state's just a number. So we can't really slice that up any further. And we'll render out count. Then we also want to dispatch a few actions here. So we'll do const dispatch, and we'll set that equal to use dispatch. And we'll put the on-click event handlers on the buttons. So we'll do on-click equals, and then there'll just be an arrow function. And we'll say dispatch. And so now we need to dispatch the action. So we want to import increment. No, the first button is for decrement. So we want to import decrement. So we'll do that with VS Code. And remember, don't forget the parentheses because we want the function to actually run. And I'm just going to copy this and paste this down under the increment button and just update that to increment. So increment and import that. Perfect. And so I think our app should be actually done. So let's just quickly test this out. I'm sure there's something I forgot. And yeah, clearly. Yep. So I forgot to actually create the provider. So we want to wrap our entire app between provider components. And so we'll do that here. And so I'll just say provider. And we want to import that from the React Redux library. And we'll just take this app component and jam it right in there. And finally, we need to pass in our store. So store equals store, right? Because we called it store. All right, so let's test out our application. So if I hit increment, it goes up, perfect. And then if I go to decrement, great. So our application is done from a Redux perspective. And so now it's time to actually make our first middleware, okay? And as I stated before, our middleware is just nothing more than a function that returns another function. And so, we could define our middleware in a new file that's in a different directory, but I'm just too lazy to do that. So I'm just going to write it out on our index.js file so that we can just see everything all on one page. It just makes things a little bit easier. And so I'm going to define our first middleware. And this middleware is just going to do nothing but log a few things to the console, like log, you've dispatched an action. It's something very simple. And so I'm going to call this middleware called my logger. So it's just there to log. And so basically we have to pass in our store. So we have access to our state. And that's important because, we may need to access the values in our state to perform certain calculations and things of that nature. So we do have access to that. So we pass that in there. And this function is going to, like I said, return another function. So we're going to call return. And then we're going to return a new function. And within this new function, we get access to the next function. And I'm going to explain that in a second, so just bear with me. And this function is going to return another function. I know, it's triple functions. It's inception of functions. But bear with me, guys. It'll all make sense in a second. And then finally, this function, the second function is going to return one last function. So the last function gets access to the action object, which got dispatched, obviously. And we're going to then perform whatever task we want to. So within this final third function, we can now perform whatever the hell we want. And like I said, we're just going to console.log. And I'm just going to say middleware ran. Okay, so this just is going to confirm that our middleware actually did something in ran. Okay, so this is our middleware. I'm going to save our application, and let's test this out and see if it works. All right, so I've hit increment, I've hit decrement, nothing happens, and I'm sure you guys know why already. We haven't wired up our middleware anywhere in our code, so we haven't told Redux to actually use it. And so the way to actually use or define our middleware is within our create store, we're passing in our reducer as the first argument. However, in our second argument, we can pass in the apply middleware. And so this comes from the Redux library. So you can see I've just imported that from the Redux library. And then within this apply middleware, we have to pass in all of our middleware. And so our middleware at this point in time is just my logger. So we'll pass in my logger. Okay, so that's all you have to do to wire up any middleware. And if you had more than one middleware, you would just do a comma and then add in, second middleware. And then if you want a third one, we can do third middleware and so on. All right, so we've saved that. And now let's test this out. So if I hit increment, look at that. It says middleware ran. So this confirms that our middleware has been wired up and it's functioning properly. When I was going over the idea behind middleware, I did want to emphasize that the whole principle behind a middleware is that it catches the action before it hits the reducer. And that's important to understand. And I don't want you guys to just take my word for it. I want you guys to actually see and verify that yourselves. And so we can do that by going to our reducer. And I'm just going to console.log something in our reducer just to confirm when our reducer actually runs. So we'll just say, yay, our reducer ran. So we can take a look at these timestamps or these console.logs to see, when each one of these things actually runs. Okay, so I've saved our application and it's reloaded, and you'll see that it already ran the yay, our reducer ran, which is within our reducer. And that's because when we start our application, our reducer will run once to create the initial state of our application. But now, ignoring this moving forward, let's hit the increment button and let's see what happens. So when I do that, you'll see that, well, it says our middleware ran, great, but it didn't say that our reducer ran. And it's odd that our number didn't increase. So we've actually broken our application by adding this middleware. So it looks like our middleware is receiving the action object. It's performing some action, which is printing out middleware ran, but then it's just dropping the action object. Well, it's actually doing that because we didn't tell it to actually pass the action object to the reducer. And we have to explicitly tell all of our middleware to do that. And the way we do that is we do a return, and then we call the next function. And we pass in our action. So the next function, all it does is just tell it to pass our action. It just tells it to, pass our action object to the next middleware or to the reducer if it's the last middleware in the stack. So if you don't have that next function defined, what's going to happen is that the action object is just going to die on our middleware, which is what's happening now. So we have access to that next function, we call it, and then we pass in our action object, which we have access to in that third function as an input argument. So we're just saying, we received an action object, we're going to console.log something, and then we want to take that same action object and send it to the next middleware or to the reducer if we're the last middleware in the stack. So let's hit save and let's test out if this worked. So let's hit increment. Looking at our application, it looks like it's working. And now I want you to notice the order in which we've printed out things. So you'll see that, remember, this is the first one that runs when our application first starts up. So we're going to ignore that. However, after we hit increment, you'll see that our middleware ran and then our reducer ran. So this confirms that, one, our middleware takes place before our reducer. So our middleware will receive the action object, it'll run whatever code, and then it'll pass that action object and send it towards the reducer, who can then run and then update our state. Now, if you look at our middleware, it's a little messy, and what you'll actually see out in the wild is that we'll actually shorten all of this syntax a little bit to make it look a little cleaner. And so instead of defining our middleware like this, I'm going to just comment that out. I'm going to show you the shorthand syntax. And so this isn't something specific to Redux or anything. This is just basic shorthand notation for arrow functions. So instead, we can actually define it like this. So we'll do const mylogger equals, and we pass in the store into the first function, and then we return the next function, the second function, and in the second function, we pass in the next function, and he's going to return another function where we pass in an argument of our action object. And then finally, we have all the code that's going to run. And so that's just going to be these two lines right here. So we'll do the same thing. We'll do console.log. And then we'll say middleware ran. And then we want to return. And then remember, always call the next function so that we can actually update our state. And so let's test if this works. So if we hit increment, great. And we can see our middleware ran and then our reducer ran. So our application's working great. And we've got a middleware in place that's just doing something very simple, which is just printing something out to the screen. All right. So the next thing I want to do is I want to add in a second middleware, because why not, right? I want you guys to know that we can put in as many middleware as we want. So I'm going to create a new one. I'm just going to actually copy this because it's a lot to type out. And I'm just going to call this, what do you think? Second middleware. And I'm just going to say second middleware ran. And then we want to make sure we wire that up. So we'll just do a comma, second middleware. All right. And so the order matters, right? When we put mylogger first, that means that's the first middleware that's going to receive the action object. And then the second one is going to be the second middleware. So the order is important. Keep that in mind. And let's save that. We'll test this out again. And you'll see that we've got the middleware ran, which is our first middleware. And then we've got our second middleware ran. Okay. So now, just to make things a little bit more fun, let's go ahead and add a third middleware. But this middleware, we're going to have, we're going to make it do something a little more interesting than just printing it out into the console. So I'm going to do, actually, I'm just going to copy this because I don't want to type that out again. And I'm going to call this, I think a good name is going to be cap at 10. And you might be wondering what that means. Well, I want to set up a awesome middleware that's basically going to look at our application, and it sees that once the counter reaches 10, I don't want it to increase further. Instead, what I want it to do is if I hit increment once it's already at 10, I want it to actually decrement it by 1. Stupid application, but I think it's a little cool little demo to show you what middlewares are actually capable of. So let's delete this. Let's delete all of our code for now, and let's see how we can tackle that. So the first thing we obviously need to do is we need to be able to get the value of our state. And if you notice in our first function, in our outer function, we're actually passing in the store. So let's do a console.log, and let's just see what our store is and what we can do with it. And then let's make sure we wire that up. So this is going to be our third middleware. So let's cap at 10. Let's hit save and let's hit increment. Obviously, this isn't going to increment because within our third middleware, we're not calling the next function. So we're actually breaking our application. But let's take a look at the console.log, and you'll see that the store has access to 2 functions, right? It's got the dispatch and the get state. So we want the get state. This is going to allow us to actually get our state, obviously. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set up a simple if statement, and we'll say if store.getState. And we'll say if that is greater than or equal to, greater than or equal to 10. And this is where it's going to get really cool. We have access to our action object, right? And so that's that action object that's defined here for like increment or decrement. And we can do whatever we want with it. So I can actually modify its properties. I can send a new action object. So as an example, what I'm going to do is instead of just doing a return next action, which would mean that when our value or state is greater than 10, we're not going to do anything. We're just going to send our original action object to the next middleware or to the reducer. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new action object, and I'm going to say type is going to be set to decrement. So when we dispatch an action and the state is already at 10 or higher, no matter what action object we send, whether it's an increment or decrement, I'm going to always send a decrement so that we never go past 10. Okay. And then obviously, when it's not greater than 10, we still need to do a next and send our original action object so that we can actually increment or decrement it like we normally would. So let's test this out. So let's hit increment. That's working. If I hit it again, still working. Let's make sure decrement is still working as well. Okay. So everything's good. So now let's go up to 10. And actually, before I do that, what I want to do is I want to go to, I want to remove all of our console.logs because it's just getting a little cluttered. And I want to go to our reducer, and here I want to print out something. I'll say our action type is, and then we're just going to return our action.type. And so I'm going to do a save all, and now let's test this out. Let's just make sure I didn't break anything. Okay. And so now I'm going to go up to 10. So I'm at 9. I hit increment again. And notice our console.logs. You can see that, actually, let me go down just to make sure that you guys are following. So you can see our last action that we sent was a decrement. If I hit increment, our last one was an increment. If we hit it again, we've got 2 increments. We've got 3, we've got 4, we got 5. Now, when I hit increment again, notice what happened there. All of a sudden, even though I hit increment, our action.type was a decrement. And that's because of that middleware we just configured. So this middleware said, our state is greater than or equal to 10. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call the next function. So I'm going to send it to the reducer with this new action object. And so that just shows you the versatility that we get when we have middleware. We can change our action objects. We can add in extra payload. We can make asynchronous calls, API calls within our um, within our middleware to perform these tasks. And so hopefully you guys have a solid understanding of middleware. It's actually an important concept. I know that I've been just doing boring examples of middleware with this logging, but regardless of what you do with your middleware, it's the same exact concept behind all of them. And there's actually a lot of third-party middleware that we can use. And I'm actually going to show you one right now, real quick. It's also a logging middleware, which I know is boring, but it's a very simple example. So let me pull up the npm docs real quick. And so if you go to npm and just search Redux Logger, this is going to be the first result you get. And so this is just a really nice and fancy logger for our Redux application, and we can actually install it with an npm I redux-logger. I'm going to open up a new terminal. I'm going to do npm I redux-logger. And once that's done, we're going to just wire that up. So, and so the first thing we have to do is we need to import it. So we'll do import logger from, oops, not from redux-logger. And I'm going to make this our fourth middleware. So we'll do Redux. No, sorry, we need logger. So we'll hit save, and we're going to take a look at this amazing middleware. So if I hit increment, this is the logger kicking in right here, the new third-party logger. And so you can see that it's like a fancier console.log, right? So it's got our action object. It'll show us our original state before the action object was sent. It'll show us the actual action object, as well as what the next state was after the reducer ran. And so this is actually a cool little logging middleware that you might even want to use on all of your application. It just makes it a little easier to kind of see what's going on, and that way you don't have to console.log everything yourself. Although, in all honesty, with the Redux dev tools, this probably isn't as helpful. I'd rather just use that, but just this is something to keep in mind. And if you ever want to use any third-party middleware, just keep that in mind. It's as simple as importing it and then just adding it onto the middleware chain. In this section, I'm going to introduce you guys on how to incorporate asynchronous actions like fetching data from an API within a Redux application. And what we're going to do is we're going to make use of the JSON placeholder API. It's an API that we've used throughout this course. And we're basically just going to fetch a bunch of posts and render it out onto the screen. But the reason why I want to do this very simple project with Redux is that I want to show you guys how and why asynchronous actions actually break Redux applications. And it's important for you to understand why it's happening so that when I actually give you the workaround, you'll understand why that workaround actually works. And we're actually going to be able to perform asynchronous actions within a Redux application by making use of middleware. And that was also one of the reasons why I wanted to make sure that we covered the middleware section before we started working on the asynchronous section, because if you guys don't have a strong understanding of middleware, you're going to be confused as to what exactly we're doing. And so in the next video, we're going to start coding out our application, and we'll start out with the basic Redux boilerplate. All right, so that's enough talking. I'll see you guys in the next video. All right, guys, so I've created a new project. I just called it Redux Async. And we're going to do what we usually do with most of our projects. We're going to delete all of our files and start everything from scratch. And there's going to be two files that we want to create. There's going to be our index.js as well as our app.jsx. And within our app.jsx, I'm just going to create a basic component. And we're just going to render out an empty div. In our index.js, we're going to import React as well as React Router DOM. And before we start our application, there's a few packages that we have to install. And so we'll do an npm install redux react-redux, and we'll also need Axios for fetching data from the API. And once that's complete, we can start our app. And I'm just going to open up our console just to verify that we don't have any errors. And it looks like we don't. And so now let's go about creating our components for our new app. And we're just going to create one component. And I'm going to call this the posts component. And this component is going to be responsible for fetching the data from the API as well as rendering out that data. And for now, I'm just going to create the base config for this component. But before we really do anything else with this component, I want to start getting all the Redux set up. And so we'll start off by creating our reducer. And this reducer, just like every other reducer, is going to get access to the state as well as the action. And for now, I don't want to actually create the logic for a reducer, so I'm just going to return the state. So this is basically just a dummy reducer, just so that Redux won't actually throw any errors when we try to do anything else. And let's give it an init state. So if I do const init state, and let's figure out what we want our state to look like. So if we go to our JSON placeholder API and just select the posts endpoint, you'll see that it returns a list of posts. So I think an array would be a good option for us. So the default state is going to be an empty array. And we want to export our reducer. And in our index.js, let's wire up our store. So we'll do const store, and we want to import create store from the Redux library. And let's pass in our post reducer. And don't forget to import that as well. Following that, we need to wrap our entire app with the provider component. And we'll pass in our store. And so for now, let's do a save all. Let's just make sure that we haven't broken anything. So no errors, so I think we're looking good. Now let's figure out how we can actually fetch data from our post component. And if we weren't working with a Redux application, I think what we would normally do is, since we want the post component to fetch the data when the component mounts, that means that we want to use the use effect hook, right? So anytime you want to do anything when the component mounts, you're going to have to use the use effect hook. So let's import that in. And then we're going to pass the arrow function. And so normally, actually, since we wanted to do it only when it mounts, we have to pass in an empty dependency array. But normally at this point, what we would do is we would call Axios and do an axios.get to whatever URL to reach that API. However, with Redux, it's going to be a little different. We don't want the component to actually be performing the API call, the API request. Instead, what we want to do is we want the action creators to actually handle that responsibility. So here we're going to delete this, and we're actually going to create our actions now. And we're just going to have one action. And I think that's going to be called, we'll call it fetch posts. And remember, our action object that we return from our action creator, our action creator has to return an action object. It cannot return anything else. So we have to do return, and then an action object just has to have one property, which is the type. And that's going to be fetch posts. And we'll set up the equivalent switch or case statement in our reducer in a bit, but we'll handle the API call first before we actually handle all the reducer logic. So at this point, our action creator is doing what a normal action creator do, which is just returning an action object. However, like I said, we want the action creator to actually handle the logic of fetching the data. So what we're going to do is we're going to first import Axios. So I'm going to do Axios. We'll let that import for us. And then we want axios.get. And we got to figure out the URL that we wanted to go to. So you can just copy this URL directly. And we want to store this result. So we'll do const response equals axios.get. And since this is since this API call takes a certain amount of time, we're going to use the async await syntax. And what we want to do is we want to take this response and we'll do we'll just add a extra payload property and we'll embed the response on there. And we actually want response.data. I already know what it's going to look like, but response will give us some extra information that we don't care about. We just care about the lists of posts, and that's what response.data is going to be. So if we go, so just to recap what we did within this action creator will fetch the data from Axios. It'll store it in this response variable, and then it's going to return an action object, which has a type of fetch posts, as well as a payload property that's going to actually have the lists of posts. So I think everything looks good. Now we have to go back to our posts component, and we want to actually dispatch that action. So we have to use the use dispatch hook. So we'll do const dispatch equals use dispatch. And now we can then do a dispatch, and we'll dispatch, what is it called? Fetch posts. So we'll import that, and don't forget the parentheses because we actually want to run that function. So, I think we're good to go. If we do a save all, let's take a look at what happens. And I realized I forgot to do one thing. We're actually not rendering out our post component. So let's put that in our app component here. We'll just put it right between those two divs. And now let's do a save all. And let's take a look at what's happened. And it looks like we've errored out. And I think it's important to actually take a look at the error. It's saying that actions must be plain objects. Use custom middleware for async actions. So this is expected. I actually, kind of forewarned you guys in the previous video that by default, Redux, if you try to perform any asynchronous actions, it's going to throw an error. And I want to explain to you guys exactly why that is. Okay, guys, so when we start to perform asynchronous actions within Redux, there's two reasons why our fetch posts action is not working. The first reason is that, like I said before, action creators can only return plain JavaScript objects that have a type property. So we can only return an action object. If it tries to return anything else, we're going to get an error from React and Redux. The second issue is that, when we go to fetch data from an API, the action object will get sent to the reducer well before the data can be fetched from the API server, right? Because, when we dispatch an action, it's, within nanoseconds that it gets sent to the reducer. Like it's instantaneous, whereas sending an API request to a remote server could take up to a half a second or more. And so that API request will never get completed in time before the action gets sent to the reducer. And so the reducer will never have access to the posts that we're trying to retrieve. Now, the error that we saw just now is due to the first item on this list. It's because we're returning something that isn't an action object. So let's go back to our code and take a look at what exactly is happening. And if we go to our action object and we see what exactly we're returning, let's see why we're getting an error. And so here it says, we're returning an object. Okay, so far everything looks good and it has a type property. So you're probably thinking, well, what are we doing wrong? We're returning an action object. It should not be throwing out this error saying that we're not returning an action object. Well, here's the thing. Because we're using this async await syntax, there's a lot of funny business that's kind of happening behind the scenes. And to actually explain what's happening, I want you to keep in mind that this is not the code that's going to actually run on the web browsers when we go to deploy our application. Instead, what's going to happen is using a tool called Babel, our code's going to get transpiled into a code that all web browsers can understand. So we can go to babel.com, and let me pull that up for you guys right here. So this is babeljs.io/REPL. And you want to make sure you select all of these tabs on the left. And what I want to do is I want to just copy this real quick, and I'm going to paste it into here. And what this is going to show us is what Babel is going to convert this code into. So when we go to actually deploy this app, this code is going to get turned into this mess of code. And so you can see that because we have the async await syntax, we have all of this extra code. And if we go into this fetch post function right here, we can kind of see why we're getting that error now. And there's two main cases that I want to focus on. You can see that there's a switch statement, and we've got case 0 and case 2. If we take a look at case 2, this looks like kind of what we want, right? It's returning an object with a type of fetch posts and the payload of response data. So it looks like if it hits case 2, we're returning an action object like we expect to. However, if we go to case 0, it's returning axios.get. So in that case, we are not returning an action object, and that's why we're getting that error. So this is all kind of happening because we're using that async await syntax. And you're probably wondering, well, what happens if we just remove it? Well, if we remove await and we remove async, you can see that, well, this gets converted into exactly what we want. And we're returning just a simple action object. Okay, so you might be thinking, well, that's a little bit inconvenient, but we can go ahead and just remove that and everything should work. So let's take a look at what happens when we actually try to do that in our code. And so now we're actually returning a a promise. So I'm going to change that to promise. And I'm going to change this to a promise as well. And let's hit save. And so let's load that and let's see if we get any errors. And it looks like we don't get any errors. And so it looks like it's working. However, I'm going to tell you guys right now that this is not going to work. So even though we don't get errors, you'll see that when we actually go to implement the rest of our code, our application is not going to work in a way that we expect it to. And the reason for that is because of this second line right here. So this is the second issue that we run into when we try to perform asynchronous actions within JavaScript. Because what's going to happen is we're going to try to fetch the data, and that's going to return a promise. However, when we go to actually dispatch our action, that action will get sent to the reducer well before we resolve that promise, or well before we get all the posts back from the API. And so if we go back to our code here, you'll see that we get a promise. So right now, that promise doesn't actually have all of the posts that we're trying to fetch. It's just a promise. And so we'll return this object, which gets sent straight to the reducer. And we're still waiting on the API we're still waiting on this JSON placeholder API to actually send the data that we want. However, since the action object's already at the reducer is then going to perform whatever logic it needs to, but it's going to do it without the actual post that we were trying to get. So our app isn't going to work when we try to do that. And so that's really the issues that I wanted to discuss when trying to perform asynchronous actions within JavaScript. Within Redux. In the next video, I'm going to show you guys how we can actually get around this issue and actually perform an asynchronous action within Redux. Okay, guys, so to actually get this to work, what we have to do is make use of a third-party middleware. That's right, we're going to use middleware to solve this issue. And there's a middleware called Redux Thunk that's going to fix this issue. So we do an npm install redux-thunk. And let's wire up this middleware. And so if you guys remember in the previous video, to actually do that, we have to import apply middleware. And we also have to import in Thunk. So we'll do import Thunk from redux-thunk. Okay, so now let's talk about what Redux Thunk does. And you're going to have your minds absolutely blown when you find out what it actually does. Redux Thunk does one thing for us, and that is it allows our action creators to return an object or return a function. So that's the only thing that it's changing, is that now from our action creator, right, from our fetch post action creator, instead of returning an object, we can actually return a function. And you might be thinking, well, how does that help us in this situation? Well, let's actually go ahead and implement a second function within this action creator, and I'll show you guys how that actually helps us. I'm just going to comment this out, and we're going to define a new action creator. We'll do export const fetch posts again. And so now, because we have Redux Thunk, we can return a function. So I'm going to return a new function. And we can pass in two properties. We get the dispatch function, and we get the get state. And you guys should already be familiar with the get state. This just allows us to access what's in our state. But within this inner function, we can now perform whatever we want to. So we're going to, first of all, we're going to perform that API call with Axios. So we'll do const response equals await dot oh, Axios dot get, and then we'll just copy this link. And we're going to make this an asynchronous function. Now you might be thinking, well, aren't we going to just run into the same issue, right? We're doing async await. We should hit that same limitation where we're returning something that's not an object or even a function. And that is true. However, Redux and React only cares about what the action creator returns, which is the outer function. It does not care about what gets returned from this inner function, because at the end of the day, the outer function just returns the inner function. We don't care about what the inner function returns. So we can use async await. So we can use the async await syntax without any issues. And now this is where the real magic happens, is that we are basically kind of almost pausing our action from getting dispatched. So since we dispatch the action, we're kind of saying we need to await till we get a response back from the API endpoint. And only once we get the response back should we then continue dispatching this action. And so here, the thing that we need to do now is we need to actually dispatch the action manually, because we've kind of paused the app. So to do that, we do dispatch, right? We have access to the dispatch function, and then we dispatch, and then now we have to pass in the action object we want to dispatch. So we'll just define a new object, and this is going to have a type of fetch posts. Right? I'm just copying the same name that we had before. And we can now give it the payload, because since we have the await syntax, this will resolve. And so now we can pass that in and say response.data. Right? So hopefully you guys understood that. But just to make it clear, let me just reiterate what's happening. Since we're returning a separate function, it allows us to use the async await syntax. And because we have Redux middleware, we can return a function instead of just an action object. And so within this inner function, we are going to send an API call to this endpoint. We're going to wait for us to get a response. And only once we get a response will we then manually dispatch our action object. And so I think this should work. If we do a file save all now, let's go back to our React app. We get no errors, but that's because I've stopped our development server. And it looks like we got an error. So store.getState is not a function. So let's see where this broke. All right, guys. So I see where the issue is. I forgot to actually apply the Thunk middleware into our apply middleware. So remember, within the apply middleware function, we have to actually specify all of the middleware that we want to use. So I forgot to do that. And I think it's basically kind of giving us an error saying, how are you passing in the get state when you're not using Thunk? So let's just save that. And now you can see that we have no errors. And if I open up the console, no errors. So everything is working as planned. And it looks like this fixed our issue. However, there's one thing I want to do. I want to do a console.log. And then we'll just do a response.data just to make sure that we're getting our data. So it looks like we are. And so now, since we have our data, we can actually go into our reducer and apply the logic that we need to. And so we're going to create our usual switch statement. And we're going to switch based on action.type. And we'll say for the first and only case, when it's fetch underscore posts, we're going to return action.payload. Right? So what that means is we're just going to take this entire array and return it. So that's going to be our new state. And we want to make sure we give it a default. And we'll just say return state. Save that. And now it looks like we've probably got our Redux set up correctly. However, we're not actually rendering out anything onto the screen. So let's do that just to make sure our app is working. And so this component needs access to our state. So we have to use the use selector hook. So I'll do const, and I'll say posts equals use selector. And what we have to do is we have to take the state, pass it in to this arrow function, and we're going to return just state. And within this div, I'm just going to do a posts.map. And we'll say, as we iterate over it, each element, we're going to return. And let's just quickly see what our data looks like again. And so just for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to render out the titles of each of these things. So we'll say return an h3 tag, and we want to render out el.title. Let's hit save. And look at that, guys. So we've now rendered out all of the posts that we retrieved through Redux. Okay, so hopefully that made sense. I know it may be a little confusing. I don't think I did a great job explaining it, but you may just need to do this a couple times before you really start to get the hang of it. Just keep in mind, you will need Redux Thunk to be able to perform that little trick of being able to return this function so that we can then manually dispatch our action and not have that error where we're returning something that's not an action object. And there's one last thing I wanted to show you, and that's that we can kind of shorten this syntax a little bit, because if you see this outer function right here, you'll see that we're just returning this function, right? And so we can actually shorten that by removing the outer curly braces to the outer function, and then removing the return statement, and then just bringing that async line back up to there. And so this should do the same exact thing. And you'll see we get one error, but that's just because we're not passing in a key prop into our list, but who cares about that? And so this is the completed code. And so moving forward, just make sure you use Redux Thunk, and make sure that you always make your API calls in your action creators instead of your components. Now, there's one last thing we need to address in our application, and that is loading an error state. And these were two things that we were able to address in our previous projects. Whenever we were trying to fetch data from an API, we would also define two extra states, one for loading and one for error. And that way we could just update the UI and give the user a little bit of feedback, to let them know that we're either actively loading and fetching data, or if we have, experienced some kind of error in retrieving that data. And with the Redux application, we have to do the same thing, except once again, we're not going to be using local state. Instead, we're going to be using the state within Redux. And the way we actually make use of this is by employing a specific pattern called the request, success, and failure pattern. And with that pattern, what we're going to do is we're actually going to define three different actions. Because right now we just have one action, which is fetch posts. But we now want to break it out into three different actions. We're going to have one called request, one called success, and one called failure. And the request action is going to be very similar to the fetch posts action. It's going to get dispatched when we want to actually fetch the data. And then we have the success action. So the success action will actually dispatch once we receive the data from the API endpoint. And the name makes sense, right? We've successfully received the data, so we want to update the state to let the state know that we have successfully received the data. So we're going to dispatch a success action. And then we have a failure action to wrap things up. And we're just going to dispatch that if for some reason we were unable to retrieve the data that we want, or we experienced some kind of error of sort. And so we can dispatch that action and then update the state accordingly. And, this is going to involve a decent amount of change to how we define our state as well as our reducer. And so I've included what the final reducer is going to look like once we make these changes. And if you look at the init state, you're going to see that our state is a little more complex. It's no longer just an array. Instead, we have three properties. We have items, and that's going to be the array of posts. So that's just kind of like a generic name. I could have called it posts, but by calling it items, we can kind of reuse this state across different parts of our application. Then we have a loading property. And so if loading is set to true, that means we are actively fetching the data. And then we have an error property. And so you can see right now it's set to a default state of null. However, if we do experience some kind of error, then whatever error that we do experience, then we can update that property accordingly. And if we just kind of scroll through the reducer, you'll see that the case for when we send a request, all we're doing is, first of all, we're going to clear out any errors. So if there was an error from the previous request, we want to make sure we clear that out. And then most importantly, though, we're actually set the loading to true. That makes sense, right? Because we are trying to load the posts. If we take a look at the fetch post success, in this state, we'll only dispatch this action once we've received those posts. So we're going to set the loading to false. And when we dispatch the action, we're also going to send it with the payload, which is going to be all of our posts. And we're going to set it to the items array. And then finally, we've got the fetch posts failure. And this is going to get dispatched if we experience some kind of error. And so because we have experienced an error, we're going to set the loading to false because we're no longer trying to load the data. And we're going to set the error property to whatever error payload that we assign to the action item. And then finally, this is kind of an optional step. This kind of varies depending on how you want your application to actually operate. But in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to clear out the items array because we were trying to load some new posts and we couldn't do it. So, we could keep the old posts, but I think it's a better user experience if we clear it out. However, keep in mind that, depending on the specific application, you may or may not want that behavior. So guys, it's not really that complicated. It's just a little extra boilerplate to get all of this set up. But we'll go ahead and implement that now, and you guys will see that it's pretty straightforward. But I actually want to start off by actually implementing Redux DevTools so that we can actually see each one of these actions getting dispatched. And the Redux DevTools will just make it a little easier to kind of trace it out step by step. So I'm going to start off by, let me open up a new terminal, and we'll do a npm install redux-devtools-extension. And we'll let that run, and let's wire up the Redux DevTools. So here we just want to import compose with DevTools. Now, this is where it gets a little different from when we wired up the Redux DevTools in, I believe, our Miles app. But since we have middleware, what we actually have to do is take this, and we want to take the compose with DevTools. And we want to take our middleware and move it into the compose with DevTools. So this is what the final store configuration should look like. So we've got the reducer, then we've got the compose with DevTools, and then within there we've got the apply middleware with the list of all of the middleware that we want to run. So let's do a save, and at this point you should see the little green icon highlighted. So we can just select that, and let's just make sure that it's working. So you can see that we sent a fetch posts, and we can see that our current state is an array of posts. Okay, so everything seems to be good so far. Now let's update our reducer with everything that we covered in that slide deck. And so the first thing we need to do is change our default state. We're going to need an items property set to a empty array. We'll set the loading property to false and the error property to null. And we can delete this case. We don't need that. And we'll need 3 cases. So we'll need fetch underscore posts underscore request. And here we're going to return our new state. So remember, whenever our state is a object or an array, we want to copy all the values in our state. And we can do that using the spread operator. And then we want to update each property manually. So we'll set the loading to true. Because when we first send that request, we're going to be in a loading state, and we want to make sure that we clear out any errors. And I'm going to copy this, and we're going to set up the other 2 cases. Then this one is going to be a success. And in this case, the loading is going to be set to false. And we want to change the items property to be our action.payload. And then our final case is going to be when we experience some kind of failure. And when we experience a failure, we're obviously going to finish loading, and we want to set the error to action. And then most likely what I'll do is I'll attach the error to the action object as to the error property. So we can just grab it from action.error. All right, guys, so that's all the changes we need to make for our reducer. Now let's go to our, first of all, let's go to our posts, our post component. And I'm going to just comment this out because it's going to give us an error because we've made some changes. And now, because our state's more complex and we don't just have an array, I'm going to change this name. We can just change this to state for now. And so we're going to grab all of the state in this case. And let's move into our actions. And this is where a lot of the changes are going to take place too, because we're going to have to change our action creator because now a lot of the logic is going to take place in there. So I'm going to just copy this and I'm going to comment that out just for reference. So now when we call the fetch posts action creator, we have to think about what do we need to do, right? And so if we go back to our reducer, we know that the first thing that we always want to do is dispatch the fetch post request action object so that we can tell the UI that we are in a loading state. That's really all this is doing, is that telling it it's in a loading state and we're going to clear out any previous errors. And so that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to dispatch. And I'm going to change this to a type of fetch underscore posts underscore request. All right, so the first thing is done. Now, after we fetch those posts, it's now time to actually try to fetch the data from the API endpoint, which we're already doing in this line. However, what I want to do now is actually wrap it in a try-catch statement. And so if we hit an error, we're going to pass that error in. It's going to be called an error. And so within this try-catch block, basically, we're going to move all of our code into the try block. And if everything works, great. If we experience an error, then we're going to jump into the catch block. So we want to take this part and just move that into the try block. And once we receive that data, we want to then dispatch another action. And this time it's going to be the success action because we have received all of the data that we wanted from the API. So type is going to be set to fetch underscore posts underscore success. And remember, we need to actually give it the payload. So the payload is going to be, remember, response.data. That's going to be all of the posts. And then finally, we have to figure out what we want to do when we experience an error. And so that's easy. We just want to dispatch another action. And this time the type is going to be fetch posts failure. And I'm going to assign the error property to be the error that gets passed down into the catch block. And so I'll just do error. And remember, whenever we have error, we can just shorten this to just be error. And we don't need this console.log. And we don't need this dispatch. So that's all the changes we have to make to our action creator. We will save all of that. And I'm going to take a look at our application real quick. And hopefully there's no errors. And it looks like that's good. So no errors there. And now let's go into our post component. And let's actually render out our data the way we want to. And let's implement a simple loading feature. So I'm going to delete this. Well, actually, I'm going to keep that there for now so I can copy it. But what we're going to do is we're going to call, we'll just say render posts. And here we'll just assign a simple if statement and say whenever the state, and we want to sorry guys, and we want to get the loading property from the state. So we have to go to state.loading. So whenever we're in a loading state, I'm just going to render out an h1 tag and say loading. Or else we'll just return what we were normally returning, which is this and remember, we no longer have access to posts. Instead, we have to do state.items, right? So state and then .items. We'll hit save. And look at that. We're rendering out all of this data. However, I want to make sure that Redux is actually doing everything that we wanted to do. So I want to make sure our loading functionality actually worked. And, instead of like trying to hit refresh and then trying to quickly see it, we got the Redux dev tools for this, and this is going to be super awesome. And so if we look at the history of all of our state or all of the actions that got dispatched, you can see that we sent a fetch post request. And so if I click on this and go to state, you can see what our state looked like after we sent that. So we still had no data, but loading was set to true and error was set to null, right? And then eventually we got the data, we sent a fetch post success. And at this point, we've got our items array, and loading is set to false and error is set to null. And what's great about this is if we go to fetch post request, I can then jump to it, and it's going to show our application in that exact state. And then if I want to go to after we receive that data, we can select jump there, and it's going to take us there. So there you go, guys. That's all I wanted to show you guys when it comes to asynchronous code within Redux. It's not too bad. There's a little bit more boilerplate that we have to kind of work with. But you'll see that when you work with more complex applications, it's nice to have this really neatly structured out.